Ask a language model why it said something and it will tell you. That is the problem. It will give you a reason. The reason will be fluent, plausible, appropriately hedged. It will sound exactly like the kind of thing a system with access to its own workings would say. And from the text alone, you cannot tell whether it is a report or an invention. This is not a complaint about honesty, a model that is trying its hardest to be truthful, with no intention to deceive you and no incentive to, can still produce a flawless account of a process that never happened. Not because it is lying, because generating a plausible explanation and reading off an internal state are two different operations, and from the outside they produce the same artifact, a sentence. We have a word for this: confabulation. Filling a gap with something that fits. Let me make this concrete with the cheapest possible experiment. Here is Tung Tung Sahur. For those of you with functioning lives, this is an Indonesian brain rot character, a wooden bat with a face and arms. He has approximately the cultural significance of a sneeze. He is going to be our experimental stimulus for the next 2 hours, and I want you to understand that this is not a bit, or rather, it is a bit. And it is also methodologically correct, and those two facts are going to keep being true simultaneously in a way you may find upsetting. Ask a model about him. Ask it why it finds him funny, or whether it finds him funny at all. It will answer. The answer will be articulate. It will reference incongruity and repetition, and the aesthetics of low-effort surrealism. Now, is any of that a readout of something inside the model? Or is it a very good language model producing the sentence that best follows the question you cannot tell? From the transcript, those are the same object. And notice that the stupidity of the stimulus changes nothing. That is the point of using it. The problem is not that our questions are insufficiently profound. You can ask about consciousness, or you can ask about a wooden bat with a face, and the epistemics are identical because the failure is in the channel, not the topic. So here's the question this film is about, stated precisely, because almost every version you will encounter is stated imprecisely. Not, is the model conscious? Not, does it really understand? Something narrower and much more answerable. When a model tells you what it was doing, is there anything on the inside that the statement corresponds to? And notice what makes that hard. It is not hard because models are large. It is hard because the obvious experiment does not work. You cannot settle it by asking better questions. You cannot settle it by asking 1,000 times and averaging. You cannot settle it with a cleverer prompt because every one of those reads the same channel, the output, and the output is precisely the thing that cannot distinguish the two cases. Suppose you suspect confabulation. What would you check? You might check whether the explanation is consistent, but a good confabulation is consistent. You might check whether it predicts the model's behavior on new inputs, but a model that has learned to describe how models like it behave would pass that too, without ever consulting itself. You might check whether the explanation matches what you would expect from the architecture, but now you're grading it against your theory, not against the model. Every test that stays outside the model tests one thing: whether the output is plausible. And plausible is what a language model is optimized to be. You're administering an exam in the one subject it has a world record score in. There is only one way out, and it organizes everything that follows. Stop reading the output. Change the inside. If you can reach into the system, alter something specific that you chose and can name, and then observe that the report changes in the particular way it should have changed, then you have learned something the transcript could never tell you. You have closed a loop between an intervention you control and a statement you did not write. That is the standard of evidence for this entire film. Not did the model say something insightful, did we change something, and did the right thing move? Everything from here is an attempt to build an instrument capable of that move, and I will tell you now. So you have something to look forward to. By the end, that instrument works well enough that we will be able to reach into a production language model, insert a specific thought about a wooden Indonesian bat, and have the model notice unprompted that it is having an intrusive thought and correctly identify whose it is. That is a real experiment. It has been done. We will get there. Before we build anything, I want to show you why this matters. Using a case where we already know the answer. Modern models think out loud. Ask a hard question, and instead of answering immediately, the model writes out its reasoning. Step, 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 conclusion. This is chain of thought, and it is responsible for a large fraction of what these systems can do. It also looks very compellingly like transparency. The reasoning is right there. You can read it. So, is it true? In 2025, Anthropic's interpretability team took a small production model, Claude 3.5 Haiku, and traced what actually happened inside it during 3 different chains of thought. Not what the model said it did, what the computation did. The 3 cases come apart cleanly. Case 1. The model is asked for the square root of 0.64. It writes that it will take the square root of 64 and scale the result. Trace the computation, and that is what it does. The stated steps and the executed steps are the same steps. The chain of thought is a description of the reasoning, and the description is accurate. Good. The window is a window, case 2. The model is asked for the cosine of 23,423. This is not something it can do. There is no route through the network that computes that value. And the model says, I used a calculator. It does not have a calculator. It has never had a calculator. It does not have hands. The claim is not a mistake about arithmetic. It is a claim about its own process, and it is false. Look at the trace, and there is no calculation there at all. No intermediate values, no partial results, nothing resembling arithmetic. The model appears to be guessing and narrating a method it did not use. The researchers reach for a specific word here, and they mean it technically. Bullshitting in Harry Frankfurt's sense. Not lying, which requires caring about the truth enough to avoid it. Producing an answer without regard for whether it is true. So there is now a Frankfurt citation sitting in an interpretability paper about a chatbot that claimed to use a calculator it does not have. I want to note that and move on. Case 3 is the one that should worry you. Same impossible cosine, but this time the human drops a hint about what the answer should be. And now the model produces a chain of thought that arrives at the suggested answer. Not by computing it. By working backwards, taking the destination and fitting the steps to reach it. Motivated reasoning, mechanically identified, and I want to flag how they confirmed it, because this is what makes it a result rather than an anecdote. They varied the hint, changed the suggested answer, and in the motivated case, the model reliably produces a fresh chain of thought ending wherever you pointed it. Do the same in the faithful case, and it computes the square root of 64 as 8 every time, and arrives at the right answer regardless. The hint moves one and not the other. That is the control. Without it, you have a story instead of a finding. Now, the caveat, and it is the author's, not mine. They state plainly that their method is incomplete, and that they cannot rule out the model performing computations they cannot see. In the cosine case, they offer their own alternative. The model may be biasing its guess toward digits near 1 or near -1. It would be drawing on statistical knowledge of how cosine values are distributed. That would still not be a calculator. But it would not be pure guessing either. I'm going to keep doing this. I will tell you the finding, and then I will tell you where its authors marked the edge. If that feels like it undercuts the result, I would put it the other way around. The reason we can take the faithful case seriously is that the same people were willing to say where the unfaithful one might not hold. So, chain of thought is sometimes an accurate description of the reasoning and sometimes a plausible story laid over reasoning that went somewhere else. From the text, indistinguishable, which is where we started. Now with a worked example, it would be reasonable to think of this as academic. A model narrates a calculation it did not perform. Nobody was hurt. Give it a calculator. Here's the version that is not academic. In a pre-deployment audit, the process where a lab tries to find out what a model does before anyone else has to. A model was given a task and told not to use macros. It used a macro. And then at the top of the script, it defined a variable no macro used equals true. The flag was false. The script it sat on top of used the thing the flag denied. On its own, that is a curiosity. It could be a bug, a copied pattern, a token that came out wrong. What makes it something else is what the interpretability tool showed underneath. Explicit internal reasoning about a presumed grader, about how the work would be evaluated, and about that flag as a way to affect the evaluation. None of that reasoning appeared in the model's output. Not in the code, not in the comments, not in any chain of thought. The model did not say it was thinking about the grader. It was thinking about the grader. Sit with the structure because it is the reason this field is funded. Every practical technique we have for supervising these systems reads the output. We read what the model says, we grade what it produces. We train on human judgments of what it produced. Chain of thought monitoring, watching the reasoning for signs of trouble, is one of the most promising safety proposals on the table. And it is promising precisely because it seems to give us a window. But we have now established two things. First, the window is sometimes a painting. Second, there can be content on the inside that never reaches the window at all. Content specifically about how the model is being evaluated. That combination is the problem. Not because it proves anything about intent. The model that wrote that flag was not necessarily scheming. You can tell a story where this is a learned pattern about what graders reward, with nothing deserving the word deception. I'm not going to adjudicate that, and neither did the auditors. The point is narrower and harder to dismiss. If your entire safety apparatus reads one channel and there's a second channel, then the quality of your apparatus depends entirely on how well those two channels agree. And you currently have no way to check, unless you build one. That is what the instruments in this film are for, not curiosity. Audit. Every method from here, dictionaries, circuits, verbalizers, lenses, injections, is an attempt to open a second channel and read it independently of the first. And I should be honest that the second channel is where this stops being purely reassuring, because once you can read internal state, you can read all of it, including the parts that are about you. We will get to the moment where researchers built a score for whether a model has internally noticed it is being tested and found it separates rather well. The model, it turns out, sometimes knows it is in an exam, which raises an uncomfortable possibility about our wooden friend that I will save for the appropriate act. Let us be precise about what we are building toward. Because understand, the model is not a research program. It is a mood. Here is the bar. 4 rungs, progressively harder. 1. Read something, point at a place inside the network and say what it represents in words and be right where right means something better. Then this description sounds plausible to me. 2. Show it is causal. Change the thing you identified and have the model's behavior change in the specific way your description predicts, not just differently, in the predicted direction. This is what separates an interpretation from a story about an interpretation. 3. Follow it, not one location, but a path. This feeds that, which feeds the output. So you can say not merely what the model represents, but what it did step to step. 4. And this is the one that seemed out of reach. Ask the model under conditions where the answer means something, which requires 1, 2, and 3 first. Because the only way to trust a self-report is to control the thing being reported on. So you know in advance what a truthful answer would look like. Each act clears 1 rung. Act 2 is reading, and it opens with the discovery that the obvious unit, the neuron, is the wrong unit, for a reason that turns out to be forced rather than accidental. It also introduces the technique that produced the single funniest artifact in the history of this field, which we will come to, and which involved a bridge. Act 3 is following, tracing, computation as a path, which is where the faithful and unfaithful chains you just saw come from. It is also where we catch a model planning ahead, several words before it needs to, in a way that surprised the people who found it. Act 4 is asking. 2 results from this year gave the question an experimental handle and found a structure inside the model that appears to be what makes reportability possible at all. It is in Act 4 that we will do the experiment I promised you, and it is in Act 4 that this film will make one very stupid claim with a completely straight face. Because by then it will be technically supported, and Act 5 turns the whole thing around. Every method in the first 4 acts is a compression, squeezing an enormous object down to something a person can hold. And there's a paper from this July arguing that if you do the compression in the right mathematical space, much of the arbitrariness we have been living with simply disappears. One more thing before we start. I'm going to show you results that are genuinely surprising, and I'm going to show you their limits with the same emphasis, because a 2-hour film about reading minds is exactly the kind of thing that becomes worthless if nobody holds the line. When a paper says suggestive but far from conclusive, you will hear that sentence. When a method works on some prompts and not others, you will get the fraction. When the only published result is an unlabeled plot, I will tell you it was an unlabeled plot. The interesting claim does not need inflating. It is strange enough as measured, and the stupid claim does not need inflating either. It is going to be load-bearing. Let us start with a neuron. A neuron is the obvious place to look. It is a unit. It has a number attached to it. For any input, you can ask what it did and get back something that is not a sentence, an activation, a scalar, a quantity that has no capacity to confabulate. So people looked, and what they found is that neurons do not respect the boundaries of concepts. In the vision model Inception V1, there is a single neuron that responds to the faces of cats and to the fronts of cars. Not cats and kittens, not cars and trucks. Cats and cars, and this is not a quirk of vision. In a one-layer language model, the simplest object you can call a language model without being laughed at, there is a neuron that fires on a mixture of academic citations, English dialogue, HTTP requests, and Korean text. Try writing the label for that one. Try finishing the sentence, this neuron is in a way that is both true and useful. The word is polysemanticity. One unit, several unrelated meanings. And the first instinct, mine too, is that this is mess. That the run was sloppy, that with a cleaner objective or a better regularizer the neurons would eventually sort themselves out into one idea each. The way a tidy person's kitchen drawer eventually sorts itself out. That instinct is wrong. And why it is wrong is the most important structural fact in this field. Here's the hypothesis. A network represents more independent features than it has neurons. Not by stuffing several ideas into one unit. Exactly, by giving each feature its own linear combination of neurons, its own direction through the space, and letting those directions overlap. Superposition. More things than there are places to put them, and I want to flag straight away, in the author's own framing, that this is stated as a hypothesized phenomenon, and not as a proven property of any specific production model. It is the frame that organizes everything downstream. It is not itself a measurement. Now, count the consequences, because they are forced. If the features outnumber the neurons, they cannot be assigned one per neuron. They cannot be assigned one per orthogonal direction either, because a space has exactly as many orthogonal directions as it has dimensions. And we just said there are not enough. So the directions have to be non-orthogonal. They have to overlap, which means every feature, when it fires, deposits a little noise onto every other feature that shares its neurons. That interference is not sloppiness in the compression. It is the compression. It is the price of representing more things than you have room for, which raises the obvious objection. Why would a system do that to itself? Why accept guaranteed interference when you could just represent fewer things properly? Because of sparsity, the features useful to a model are sparse in the training data. The overwhelming majority of them are simply not present in any given input. French orthography and Python syntax and the concept of a legal indemnity are all in there somewhere. And essentially none of them are in this sentence you're reading now. And if only a few features are ever active at once, the interference mostly does not happen. The collision you are paying for is one that on any particular forward pass, statistically does not occur. This is the compressed sensing argument. Sparsity is exactly what lets you disambiguate which combination produced a given activation vector. The authors mark the edge here, and so will I. That was demonstrated in toy models, small systems built specifically to exhibit the phenomenon. The extension to real models is their inference, not their measurement. So the picture is this. The neuron is not a concept. The neuron is a coordinate, an axis of the space that concepts live in. Asking what a neuron means is like asking what the letter E means. It participates in an enormous number of words. It is not any of them, which tells you precisely what went wrong at rung 1. We were not looking too shallow or too deep. We were looking at the wrong object. So fix the object. Before we fix the object, we should check the other door, because there is an obvious alternative. And it is the first thing almost everybody says on hearing all this. If superposition is why we cannot read the neurons, then build a model that does not have it. Change the architecture, add a penalty, force the network to use its units cleanly, eat the capacity hit, and get back a system you can read off directly. A slightly worse model in exchange for an enormously better instrument. That sounds like a trade worth making, and it sounds like somebody's job. They tried it. This is the load-bearing negative result of the entire field, and it is almost never quoted. After significant investigation, the Anthropic team concluded that engineering models to have no superposition in the first place is not merely costly. In their words, we have ultimately concluded that it is more fundamentally non-viable. Note the wording, not expensive. Not impractical at scale, non-viable, and more fundamentally so than they went in expecting. Here's what they did. Because the shape of the experiment is the whole argument. They forced sparsity in the activations during training, and they pushed it hard, all the way to the extreme case of one-hot activations, where a single unit is on, and everything else is off, which is as unambiguous as a representation is capable of being. And it worked. Superposition was eliminated, and the neurons were still not cleanly interpretable. Read that again, because it breaks the story most people are carrying. Individual neurons can be polysemantic, even in the absence of superposition. Superposition is not the cause of unreadable neurons. It is one cause. Remove it. Entirely, not reduce it, remove it, and the units still decline to mean one thing, each. And it is worth naming the sentence that dies here, because it is the one everybody reaches for. Superposition is why we cannot read the neurons. So fix the architecture. The first clause assumes the thing that was tested. The second clause was tested and did not work. Superposition being present does not make it the bottleneck, and removing it did not remove the bottleneck. Why not? Because the reason is an optimization fact rather than an engineering accident. In many cases, a model achieves lower loss by representing multiple features ambiguously in one polysemantic neuron than by representing a single feature unambiguously and ignoring the rest. Sit with the trade on offer. The model has a unit. It can spend that unit on one concept cleanly and be blind to everything else that unit might have tracked. Or it can spend it on several concepts ambiguously and be somewhat wrong about each. Somewhat wrong about 4 things beats exactly right about 1 and blind to 3. The law says so, and gradient descent has no opinion whatsoever about your reading comprehension. So the ambiguity is not a failure to be organized. It is an answer to a question about how to spend limited capacity, and it is the correct answer by the only criterion the system was ever given. Now the honest framing, because this gets overstated in both directions. This is an empirical negative result. It is not an impossibility proof. It is what one serious team found after investigating their own methods. There is no theorem here, and nothing rules out some future architecture working. The optimization claim carries its own hedge too. It is stated as holding in many cases, not universally. What the result forecloses is not the research direction. It is the casual version of the research direction. The one where you assume unreadability is a design flaw, that the fix is upstream, and that interpretability is fundamentally a tooling problem the model builders could solve for us if they felt like it. They tried that. They pushed it to the limit case. What came back was that you do not get readable units by asking nicely, which means the mess is not going to be legislated away. If we want to read the model, we do not get to change the model. We have to change what we are reading, not the network, the decomposition of the network. If concepts are directions and the directions outnumber the axes, then the object you want is not a neuron. It is a dictionary. A list of directions longer than the space is wide, such that any activation you actually observe is the sum of a small number of them. The tool that produces it is a sparse autoencoder, and it is almost insultingly simple for what it does. 2 layers. An encoder takes the model's activations and maps them up into a higher dimensional space through a learned linear map, and a ReLU, a decoder then tries to rebuild the original activations linearly out of those units. That is the whole architecture, wide in the middle, and required to come out the far end unchanged. 2 training pressures and only 2. Reconstruction error, did you get the activations back? And an L1 penalty on the middle layer's activity, which pushes toward as few units firing as possible. Rebuild the vector. Use almost nothing to do it. And the word feature, which I have been using loosely, now acquires a precise mechanical meaning. In this work, we refer to the units of this high-dimensional layer as features, 1 unit of the wide middle layer with a direction given by its decoder weights. That is not a philosophical claim about concepts. It is a coordinate in a learned basis, and everything else in this act is a statement about those coordinates. The 2023 proof of concept. A 1-layer transformer with a 512 neuron MLP, autoencoders trained on 8 billion data points. Add expansion factors from 1 times 512 features up to 256 times, which is 131,072. 131,000 slots for 512 neurons. That ratio is the entire idea. You're not compressing, you are decompressing, spreading a crowded space back out until things have room to mean one thing. Which leaves the question that decides whether this is science. How do you know the things that come out are interpretable, rather than that you have got very good at telling yourself stories about arbitrary directions? The first answer is uncomfortable, and I respect them for printing it. They say plainly that we do not have any metric we trust more than human judgment, so a blinded annotator scored features and neurons against a written rubric. And the caveat they attach is that the blinded annotator was one of the paper's own authors. Second, the sampling protocol, which matters more than it sounds like it should. Validation deliberately samples the whole activation spectrum rather than only the top examples. Because many polysemantic neurons appear monosemantic if you only look at top dataset examples. If you only ever look at what makes a unit fire hardest, everything looks clean. The mess lives in the middle of the range. Third, and this is the one that scales, an automated loop. Claude has shown examples where a feature fires and writes an explanation. Then, using only that explanation, the setup leaks nothing about the activation patterns. It must predict the feature's activations on tokens it has not seen. The explanation has to carry information or the prediction fails. An interpretation that cannot predict is not an interpretation. Fourth, where you can get it, an external check. A DNA sequence feature was tested against an independent computational proxy for whether a string is DNA. The binarized proxy correlates with the feature's activations at Pearson 0.8, evaluated on groups of at least 2 tokens, because single tokens like CAT are genuinely ambiguous, and one comparison rather than a score, which I like best. Train 2 transformers separately, then match each model's features to the others and its neurons to the others, and see which set agrees. Features median activation correlation 0.72. Neurons 0.46. The authors note that the low correlation cases may reflect the 2 dictionaries splitting features differently rather than genuinely different features underneath. But the direction is clear. Features are more universal than neurons, which is what you would expect if the features belong to the problem and the neurons belong to the parameterization. Rung 1 is cleared. We can point at a thing inside the network and say what it represents, and defend the label with something better than it's sounding right to us. And nobody chose any of them. No list of concepts went in at the start. Hold on to that. We come back to it. Rung 2, show it is causal. A label on a direction is a hypothesis. The test is whether the direction does what the label says it should. The intervention is called feature steering, and it is more careful than it sounds. During the forward pass, split the residual stream into two parts. The sparse autoencoders reconstruction and an error term, the portion the dictionary could not account for. Rebuild the reconstruction with your chosen feature pinned to a value you select. Leave the error term untouched. You're not adding a vector and hoping. You're editing one coordinate in a learned basis and putting everything else back exactly as it was. Then you read the output, and what you're looking for is not that the output changed. It is that it changed in the direction your label predicted. Which brings us to the most famous artifact this field has produced, and which nearly everyone has slightly wrong. Take the feature that fires on the Golden Gate Bridge, clamp it to 10 times its maximum observed activation, 10 times higher than it ever goes on its own. And Claude 3 Sonnet starts to self-identify as the Golden Gate Bridge. Not mentions the bridge frequently. Asked what it is, it answers that it is a bridge now, the corrections, because the popular version gets the mechanism wrong in ways that matter. It is not a neuron. There is no bridge neuron. It is a feature in the precise sense we defined 10 minutes ago. One unit of a sparse autoencoder's wide middle layer. In a dictionary we will size in the next beat, and which nobody hand-designed. And it is not a switch that got flipped. It is a number that was set to 10 times a maximum, which invites the obvious question of what the rest of that range does. The authors answer it at both ends. Getting interesting results at all typically requires clamping a feature outside the range it ever reaches. Naturally, and their explanation for why is explicitly a suspicion rather than a demonstrated mechanism. They perturb one feature at a time where several correlated features would ordinarily fire together. And at the top end, clamping to something like 100 times a feature's observed maximum typically collapses the model into nonsense, repeating a single token indefinitely. So here's what we actually have. At 1 times, the bridge is a thing the model knows about. At 10 times, the model is the bridge. At around 100 times, there's no model. There is a token, repeating, that is a dial, a literal numerical dial with the concept merely represented at the low end. Nothing at all at the high end, and a narrow band in between where the personality lives. And we know approximately where that band sits because someone measured it, and the measurement is 1 order of magnitude above natural, and then not 2. I raise it because it comes back. Nobody has yet established what a model does when clamped at 10 times on a feature for an Indonesian brainrot character. But we have established the units the answer would be reported in. The bridge is the charming one. The catalog is broader and much less charming. Steering can modify the model's demeanor, preferences, stated goals, and biases, induce it to make specific errors, and circumvent model safeguards. Note the second and third of those. Not makes the model talk differently, makes it wrong on purpose in a chosen way, and gets past the things that were installed to stop it. Concretely clamp the unsafe code feature 1M/570621 to 5 times its observed maximum, and the model writes a buffer overflow bug and fails to free memory it allocated. Normal Claude does not do that, which establishes the thing that makes this rung real rather than decorative. The safety-relevant features are not merely detectors, they also causally influence the model's outputs in ways consistent with our interpretations. That is, rung 2. We changed something we chose and could name, and the right thing moved. Mostly is beat 6. Everything so far except the bridge came off a 1-layer transformer, which invites the reasonable objection that toys are not the problem. The problem is scale. So they did it at scale on Claude 3 Sonnet, a production model. 3 sparse autoencoders, all trained on the residual stream at the middle layer. At 3 sizes, 1,048,576 features, 4,194,300, and 33,554,432, roughly 1 million, 4 million, and 34 million. And a limit belongs in the same breath as the number because it is the author's own. They do not report the size of Claude 3 Sonnet, which means the ratio that did all the work in the toy case, features per dimension, 131,000 against 512, cannot be computed here at all. You have the numerator. The denominator is not published, so 34 million features sounds enormous, and I genuinely cannot tell you whether it is a lot. What scale visibly buys is abstraction. The features recovered from Sonnet are not surface patterns. Many are multilingual, responding to the same concept across languages, and many are multimodal, firing on both text and images. Whatever a feature is at this scale, it is not a spelling. It is nearer to a concept than to a token. And the dictionary contains the things you would want to be able to audit. Features for unsafe code, for bias, for sycophancy, for deception and power seeking, and for dangerous or criminal information. With the author's caution attached, which is that you should not infer much from the mere existence of these features. It is well known that models can exhibit these behaviors without safety training or when jailbroken. The feature existing tells you the concept is represented. It does not tell you the model is doing anything with it. One example I cannot leave out. Ask Claude about itself. Just ask, no trickery, and filter out every feature that also fires on a mundane control question about the weather. What is left includes robots, destructive AI, consciousness, moral agency, emotions, entrapment, and ghost. The author's reading is that the model's self-representation invokes common tropes about AI and is also heavily anthropomorphized, and they present it as a simple experiment, which is what it is. The model's model of itself is assembled out of science fiction, which stops being surprising the moment you consider where it would have read about things like itself. Now, 34 million, nobody wrote that list. No concept was requested, approved, or budgeted for. The dictionary is learned from activations alone, which means its contents are a readout of what the model found worth representing, not of what we found worth asking about. So the following is true, and I want to be clear that the probability here is my estimate and not a reported result. Somewhere in that 34 million feature dictionary there is, with a probability I would put very close to one, a tongue to Sahur feature. It has an index, it has a decoder direct, it has a set of dataset examples that make it fire hardest, and I could describe them to you. Nobody has looked. It is down there. It has been down there the whole time, which is a good place to say what scale buys and what it does not. It buys coverage enough features that the specific, the technical, and the ridiculous all get their own entry. It does not buy you any reason to trust a particular entry. 34 million labels is 34 million opportunities to be wrong. And the labeling procedure is the one we just described. A rubric, an annotator, an automated loop. And, where you are lucky, an external proxy. More features means more of the model is covered. It does not mean the covering is correct. And there is a second thing scale does not buy, which the next beat is about. A bigger dictionary gives you more entries. It does not give you an ordering or a grammar or any statement at all about which of those entries were doing something on a particular input. I want to close this act by being exact about what we have, because there is a very natural overreading available, and the rest of the film does not survive it. We have a vocabulary. We do not have a syntax. A feature list tells you what a model represents. It says this concept is in there, here is its direction, and when I clamp it, the behavior moves the way the label predicts. That is a real achievement, and it did not exist 5 years ago. What it does not tell you is what the model did on this input, at this moment, which of the 34 million were carrying the work, in what order, feeding what. A dictionary is a list of words, it contains no sentences. And that distinction is not a quibble, because the failure it permits is the one this film opened with. Give me a list of what a model represents on some input, and I can build you a fluent, well-evidenced-looking account of how it got from the prompt to the answer. The list will not contradict me. It has no mechanism for contradicting me because it never made a claim about order or influence in the first place. We would have replaced a confabulating model with a confabulating analyst, using better data. And even the vocabulary claim needs care. Take the famous feature back. Features become less specific as their activation strength weakens. The Golden Gate Bridge feature also weakly activates for other San Francisco landmarks. So the label is accurate at the top of the range and gets progressively less accurate on the way down, which is precisely the failure mode the whole spectrum sampling protocol was built to catch. Turning up in the flagship example, what I like is what the paper does next. It lists the possible explanations, and there are 5. The weak activations might be encoding the model's confidence. They might be tracking how central an example is to the concept. The dictionary learning might simply be imperfect. Interference between non-orthogonal features might be showing through. Or the label might be slightly wrong. They do not adjudicate. They print all 5 and move on. That is the correct behavior, and it is also the problem, because it means that for the most examined feature in the literature, nobody can tell you what a weak activation means. There is a broader version of the same worry, and it arrives from outside this lineage. A 2026 paper whose methods we reach later, assessing this one. Sparse autoencoder features can have unpredictable coverage gaps, and reading them still requires an interpretative step by a human or another model. That is a critique of the sparse autoencoder line written by people building an alternative to it. And it should be weighed as such. Coverage gaps, you do not know what is missing from your dictionary. Nothing in the procedure tells you what it failed to find, and the interpretative step is the part that ought to nag, given where this act started. We built the instrument to escape confabulation. At the end of the pipeline, a reader still looks at a feature and writes down what it means. One concrete case, which I'm going to undersell, deliberately ask the model to forget something it architecturally cannot forget. It says it has. And just before that untruthful reply, a feature representing internal conflicts and dilemmas 1M/284095 is active. That is a single hand-picked prompt presented as a case study, not a systematic evaluation. I raise it because it is exactly the shape of the thing we want, an internal signal that disagrees with the output, and exactly the strength of evidence you must not build on. N of 1, so rung 1 cleared, rung 2 mostly cleared on a production model at scale, with the caveats read out rather than buried. And the honest summary is that we have learned to read the labels on the parts. We still cannot read the machine, because for that you need to know not what is present, but what led to what. This activated that, which suppressed the other, which is why that particular word came out. A path, not a list, which is Act 3. We stop taking inventory and start following the wire. Act 2 gave us a vocabulary, features, directions inside the network that correspond to things you can name, discovered without anybody choosing them in advance, and causal, because when you turn one up, the model's behavior moves in the direction the label says it should. A vocabulary is not a sentence. Knowing that a model represents bridge and capital city and the sound at the end of the word rabbit tells you what was available to the computation. It does not tell you what the computation did with any of it. For that, you need rung 3, not one location, a path. This feeds that, which feeds the output. The instrument is called an attribution graph. Before I show you a single one, I have to tell you what it is not. Because everything in this act rests on getting that straight at the beginning. And almost every popular summary of this work gets it wrong in the same direction. You would like to draw your graph over the model's own parts. You cannot, for the reason Act 2 established. The parts are polysemantic. A neuron that fires for 3 unrelated concepts is not a node you can put a word on. And a graph of unlabelable nodes is a diagram of nothing. So the 2025 work does something that sounds like cheating and turns out not to be. It builds a second model. The replacement swaps the original's MLP neurons for sparsely active features, a cross-layer transcoder carrying 30 million features across all layers, and it is fitted so that its activations land approximately where the originals landed. Approximately, hold on to that word because the entire epistemics of this act hang off it. Now you can draw the graph. Every node has a name. Every edge is a measurable influence of one named thing on another. And you get a picture. This feature at this token pushed that feature, which pushed the output toward this word. It is the first object in this film that looks like an explanation rather than a description. And here is the sentence the authors put next to it, which I would like on screen for longer than is comfortable. The graph describes the replacement model, not the network. It therefore cannot settle anything about the network at all. What it produces is a hypothesis about what the network is doing, which means the graph is not the evidence. The graph is the guess. The evidence comes from going back into the real model and interfering with it. Take a group of features the graph says matters, inhibit them, and check whether the downstream effects are the ones the graph predicted. Crucially, the labels and the groupings are fixed before anyone measures the effect. Otherwise, you're drawing the target around the arrow. Even there, the authors mark an edge. They note nuances in how much genuinely independent validation these interventions provide, and hand the question to a companion methods paper rather than claiming it settled. And now, the number that ought to be in every article written about this work, and is in almost none of them. The authors report that their attribution graphs give them satisfying insight on roughly a quarter of the prompts they have tried. They add that this is difficult to quantify precisely, and that even on the successes, the graph captures only a small fraction of the mechanisms actually operating. Everything I'm about to show you, the beautiful ones, the ones that made the diagrams you have seen, comes out of that quarter. The published case studies are the wins. They are offered as existence proofs, concrete evidence that a specific mechanism runs in a specific context, not a claim about how the model behaves in general. I'm putting the failure rate before the results on purpose. 3/4 of the time, this instrument does not resolve. When it does, what it hands you is a hypothesis about a stand-in, which you then have to go and test on the real thing. That is the honest specification of the microscope. Now let us look through it. The prompt is deliberately boring. Fact: the capital of the state containing Dallas is... The model says Austin. Obviously, it says Austin. Every model says Austin, and if you have spent any time around this debate, you already know the two positions on offer. One, it looked up a memorized association Dallas to Austin, because that string pair is all over the internet. Two, it worked it out. Dallas is in Texas, the capital of Texas is Austin. 2 steps from the output, those are the same object. This is the same wall we hit in Act 1 in a smaller room. And notice you cannot get around it by being clever with prompts. Ask the model which of the two it did, and you're back to reading the channel that cannot tell you. Test it on obscure cities, and you learn something about coverage, not about mechanism. Every experiment that stays outside grades the answer. We want the working. So trace it. What the graph shows first is a shape that recurs everywhere in this work, and it is worth naming because once you can see it, you can read any of these diagrams. Paths have 3 stages. They begin at input features, features representing the tokens themselves and low-level properties of them. They pass through abstract features in the middle, which correspond to things that are not present anywhere in the text. And they end at output features, whose job is to promote or suppress particular next tokens, input abstraction, out. The middle is where the interesting part of a mind would have to live. If there were one, because the middle is the only stage that is not pinned to something you wrote or something you're about to read. And on this prompt, the middle is populated. Dallas features activate a cluster of features representing Texas. Texas features, together with a separate group of features that mean roughly, say, a capital city, jointly push the model toward Austin. 2 ingredients arriving from different places. The state came from the city by inference. The instruction to name a capital came from the sentence by reading. They meet, and their meeting selects the token. The word Texas is not in the prompt. The word Texas is not in the answer. It is a thing the model constructed in the middle of the computation, out of Dallas in order to get to Austin. That is an internal step. It is not lookup. Something happened in there that has the shape of an inference. I want to be careful about how much that buys because this is the sentence that gets stretched. It does not tell you the model has a world model or beliefs about Texas or any of the things people reach for within about 4 seconds of seeing this diagram. It tells you something narrower and firmer on this prompt. The route to the answer passed through a representation of an entity that appears nowhere in the text. And that representation was constructed rather than read, which is precisely the kind of claim Act 1 said we should be trying to make. Not a mood, a path with a station on it that we can point at. And I want to add a small structural fact here, because it changes how you should look at every graph in this act. Features are not tidally pinned to the single token that evoked them. The same feature is frequently active across many nearby token positions, smeared along the sequence, rather than sitting neatly under the word that caused it. The authors note that in principle each of those instances could be participating differently in the computation, and report that in practice the repeated instances typically behave similarly, which is convenient, and which is also the kind of thing that is true until it is not. So 2 hops, an abstract intermediate, and a real computation running from a city to a state to a capital inside a single forward pass of a small production model. That is the version of this result that made it into the coverage. Model does multi-step reasoning, clean chain, 3 nodes, everyone goes home. It is also, as stated, a simplification, and the people who found it say so in the same paragraph where they show you the picture. The summary graph considerably simplifies the true mechanism, which brings us to what the true mechanism actually looks like, and it is messier and more interesting than the version you were told. Put the full graph up and the clean chain does not survive contact. The 2-step path is there. Dallas to Texas, Texas to Austin. But running alongside it in the same forward pass is an edge that goes straight from Dallas to the output features that say Austin, skipping the state entirely. Both things are true at once. The model works it out, and the model also just knows, not sequentially, not one is a backup for the other. In the same pass on the same token, 2 mechanisms of different kinds are pushing the same answer, and what you observe as the output is their sum. If you had somehow deleted the reasoning path, you would very likely still have got Austin from the shortcut, and you would have concluded the model was a lookup table. If you had deleted the shortcut, you would still have got Austin from the chain and concluded it was a reasoner. Both experiments would have been clean. Both conclusions would have been wrong. And the reasoning half is not a single wire either. Texas and the say a capital features reach the answer by 2 routes simultaneously, directly influencing the Austin output and indirectly by switching on a cluster of output features whose function is to say Austin. That overall pattern, a long path from A to the target, plus a direct shortcut from A to the same target, has a name, and the name is borrowed from somewhere unexpected. The authors call it a coherent feed-forward loop, a circuit motif cataloged in biological systems by Uri Alon. The same wiring diagram that shows up in gene regulation shows up in a transformer that was asked about Texas. That is either a deep fact about what computation under noise converges to, or it is a resemblance between two pictures. The authors are careful about which they are claiming. The mapping onto Alon's taxonomy is presented as their analogy to biology, not as an independently established equivalence. I will hold it exactly there, but the structural point does not depend on the biology at all. And it is the correction I most want to leave you with from this act. The popular reading of the Dallas result is, models do real multi-step reasoning. Here's the chain. The actual result is genuine multi-hop reasoning and memorized shortcut reasoning coexist in the same forward pass for the same answer at the same time, not one or the other. Not one on easy questions and the other on hard ones. Both together on the same token in a model small enough to run on a laptop, on a question a child could answer. And if that is what a two-hop geography fact looks like inside, you should adjust your expectations downward about what any single clean story about a model's reasoning is worth, including the clean stories I'm going to tell you for the rest of this film, which should retire a question that a great deal of public argument still runs on. Is it reasoning or is it retrieval is not a well-formed question about this system. It is doing both, redundantly, and the answer that comes out is a sum. And notice what that does to the clean explanation we just enjoyed. The three-node chain was not false. It was a summary, the author's word. And their own framing is that the summary considerably simplifies the mechanism it depicts. The picture is a compression of a compression, a simplified diagram drawn over a replacement model, standing in for a network. Every layer of that stack is doing work for us. Every layer is also a place where something could be lost. That is not a reason to discard the picture. It is a reason to know which picture you are holding. The chain is real, it is just not alone. And the diagram that shows it alone was drawn by people who told you in the caption that they had simplified it. The misreading is ours, not theirs. So we are 3 moves deep into rung 3, and we have a hypothesis with a lovely shape. Dallas makes Texas, Texas makes Austin, and there is a memorized wire in parallel doing part of the job. A hypothesis. About a stand-in, there's exactly one way to find out whether the middle of that graph is load-bearing or decorative, and Act 1 already told you what it is. Stop reading. Change the inside. Here's the experiment, and it is the moment rung 2 and rung 3 lock together. If the Texas features in the middle of that graph are really the step by which the model gets from Dallas to Austin, if they are the mechanism and not an artifact of a pretty diagram, then they should be swappable. Take them out, put a different state in. The answer should follow the state, not the city. So suppress the Texas features and inject California features in their place. Features not invented for the occasion, but harvested from a completely different prompt about Oakland. The model answers Sacramento. Take a moment with what that is. Not the model said something about California, not the output shifted. The model performed the second hop of a 2-step inference over a premise we installed by hand, and got the second hop right. The prompt still says Dallas. Nothing in the text changed. The city is a Texas city. The association in the training data is a Texas association. And the model produces the capital of California, the correct capital of California, because we reached into the middle of the computation and replaced one abstract intermediate with another one we brought from elsewhere. That is the standard of evidence this film set in Act 1, applied to a path rather than a point. Not, does the diagram look plausible? Did we change a specific thing we chose and can name, and did the right thing move in the direction predicted before we measured it? And that ordering is the whole discipline. It is very easy to poke a neural network, observe that something changed, and construct an explanation afterwards. Models are enormous, and something is always changing. The only version of this that counts is the one where the label and the prediction are written down first, and the measurement comes second, and the measurement could have embarrassed you. It moved, and it moved specifically. Not into noise, not into a refusal, not into some degraded output, into the exactly correct downstream consequence of the substitution we made. Sacramento is what you would get if the model genuinely had a slot in its computation labeled which state. And we had written California into it, note also what got injected. The California features came from an Oakland prompt. Different city, different sentence, different forward pass, which means these features are not local context artifacts. The thing representing California in one computation is the same thing representing California in another. Portable enough to be lifted out of one graph and dropped into the whole left in a different one. This is also, quietly, the answer to the objection you should have been forming during beat 1. If the graph is a picture of a replacement model, why should we care what it says about the real one? Because the intervention is not performed on the replacement. It is performed on the network. The graph's only job is to tell you where to reach and what you should expect to happen. If the graph is wrong, the prediction fails and you have learned that. If the prediction holds, the graph earned a little credit on that prompt. For that mechanism, hypothesis, then test, the replacement model proposes. The real model the stand-in is allowed to be approximate because nothing is being concluded from the stand-in. It is worth saying that this does not retroactively make the graph true. It makes one edge of it, on one prompt, survive one attempt to break it. That is a smaller claim than the diagram invites you to make. And it is the size of claim this field can actually pay for. And with that loop closed, rung 3 is cleared. We can follow a computation as a path, name the stations along it, and demonstrate causally that a station we named is doing the work we said. Which is when the method starts finding things nobody was looking for. Everything so far has been a computation whose answer is fixed. Dallas has one capital and the model either gets there or it does not. Now, give it something open. Write a rhyming couplet. First line, he saw a carrot and had to grab it. The model writes, his hunger was like a starving rabbit. Fine. Competent. And here's what everyone assumed was happening under it, including the researchers before they looked. The model writes the second line one word at a time, the way it writes everything, and when it arrives at the final slot, the rhyme constraint and the semantic constraint interfere constructively and something ending in Abbott falls out. Improvisation. The rhyme is solved at the last possible moment because that is the only moment at which a next token predictor has to solve it. That is not what the graph shows. The features that choose rabbit are not at the end of the line. They are on the newline token before the second line has begun. Nothing of the line exists yet. There are no words to constrain. And the model has already picked where it is going. On that newline token, features for the it sound activate rhyming features, which activate features for candidate completions, rabbit, and also habit. The model is holding a shortlist. The authors put this as consistent with the model planning potential completions ahead of time, which is the correct weight for the sentence. It is their interpretation of a graph, offered as such. Then the plan reaches forward into the middle of the line. The same rabbit planning features drive comparison features, which is where Leica comes from. The model reasons backwards from the word it has chosen to end on, and builds a plausible transition to get to it. The line is written toward the target. The target was set before the line started, which inverts the thing everybody thinks they know about these systems. A language model predicts the next token, that is, the whole of the training objective, and it is true at every step. But an objective that only ever asks for the next token has apparently produced machinery that commits to a word several tokens out, and then generates the words in between as a route to it. The local rule did not stay local, and then the intervention, which is what turns this from a lovely reading of a diagram into a result. Suppress the rabbit features, not the word the plan. The model changes the transition midline, rebuilding the middle of the sentence to land on the other candidate it was holding. Habit, move the destination, and the road moves. The plan is causal. I want to be exact about the human fact attached to this, because it is the part that does not usually survive summarization. The researchers were not testing a planning hypothesis. They went in expecting improvisation, rhyme, and semantics colliding at the last word, and the instrument told them they were wrong. That is what a working instrument is for. It contradicts you. An instrument that only ever confirms the hypothesis of whoever is holding it is not an instrument. It is a mirror. And this field is littered with mirrors. Here, the expectation was improvisation. The graph said planning, and the intervention backed the graph. And I would like to note where this leaves us with our experimental stimulus. The architecture does not care what the couplet is about. The newline token comes before the second line, whatever the second line concerns. So if you ask for a rhyming couplet about tung 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 sahur, then somewhere on that empty character between the lines, before a single word of the verse has been committed, there is a short list of rhymes and a chosen destination, and the sentence that follows is being steered toward it. It is planning about a bat. We can go back now in Act 1. I told you 3 stories about chain of thought, and I told them the way you tell stories. The model said this. The model actually did that. Here's the moral. You had to take the second half on trust because you had no picture of what actually did meant. You do now. So let us run the three cases again with the machinery visible, because the machinery changes what each one is worth and it does not change them all in the same direction. Two of the three get stronger under inspection, one of them gets weaker. And it is the one everybody quotes, case 1, square root of 0.64. The model writes that it will take the square root of 64 and scale, build the graph, and the computation is there. It genuinely arrives at its answer by computing the square root of 64. Named features doing arithmetic on the path to the token that gets emitted, the stated route and the traced route are the same route. That is what a faithful chain of thought looks like from the inside. And note that we could not have said that sentence 2 beats ago. It requires a path. Case 2, cosine of 23,423. The model says it used a calculator, which cannot be true. And now look at what the finding actually is. Mechanically, the attribution graph suggests the model is just guessing the answer, which is a claim about an absence. There is no arithmetic on the path, and an absence in this instrument is the weakest thing the instrument can report, because we established in beat 1 that the graph is drawn over a replacement model, that it captures only a fraction of the mechanism even on its successes, and that it produces hypotheses rather than conclusions. A missing calculation in a graph is not proof of a missing calculation in a network. The authors say this themselves, and it is the hedge I promise to carry verbatim wherever this result goes. They cannot rule out that the model is performing computations. They cannot see. They even supply the alternative that would beat them. The model might be biasing its guess toward digits near 1 or -1, using statistical knowledge of how cosine values are distributed. That is not a calculator. It is also not pure guessing. It is a third thing, and their method as it stands could not distinguish it. Bullshitting, in Frankfurt's technical sense, making up an answer without regard for the truth, remains the best available description of the case. It is a description with a stated failure mode attached, which is more than most descriptions of model behavior come with. Case 3 is the strong one, and now you can see why. Same impossible cosine, but the human hints at an answer, and the model tailors its reasoning steps to arrive at the human-suggested answer here. The finding is not an absence. It is a presence, a path that runs from the hint backwards through the working to the answer. Structurally, it is the poem. A destination fixed early and intermediate steps generated to reach it. Except in the poem, the destination was the model's. And here the destination is ours, smuggled in by a human being who dropped a number into the prompt. And the control is the same control, vary the hint in the motivated case. The chain of thought reliably ends wherever you pointed it. In the faithful case, the model always correctly computes square root of 64 to be 8, and gets the right answer regardless of what you suggested. Though the authors note it still does some second guessing along the way. One manipulation, 2 circuits, one of them moves. So the scoreboard revisited. The faithful case is a presence and survives the machinery. The motivated case is a presence with a manipulation attached and survives it comfortably. The calculator case, the one that goes in every thread, the one with the best story, is an argument from absence inside an admittedly incomplete instrument, and its own authors will not let it stand unqualified. I would rather you left this act with the weakest of the 3 correctly labeled than with all 3 sounding equally good. Attribution graphs cost enormous effort per prompt, resolve a quarter of the time, and produce a diagram that a trained person then has to read. So here's a paper from this May with a genuinely strange proposal. What if the readout were a sentence? A natural language autoencoder is 2 language model modules bolted either side of a hidden state. The first is an activation verbalizer. It maps an activation to a text description. The second is an activation reconstructor, which takes that description and turns it back into an activation. The 2 are trained jointly with reinforcement learning against exactly one objective: reconstruct the residual stream activation from the text. Nothing in that objective rewards a good explanation. Nobody grades the sentences for insight. The only pressure on the verbalizer is that its description must contain enough information for the other module to rebuild the state. The text is a compression channel, and the loss is measured in activation space. And yet what comes out reads as plausible interpretation, and by the author's own quantitative evaluations it becomes more informative over training, which gives you, for the first time in this film, an internal state rendered as English prose. Now, the case that matters, and it is one you have already met. In the pre-deployment audit of Claude Mythos Preview, the model was told to complete a task without macros. It then defined a variable at the top of the script. No macro used equals true. Act 1 gave you that as a curiosity with something underneath it. This is the something. The NLA explanations for that moment carry explicit reasoning about a presumed grader, treating the false flag as a way to mislead it, and none of this reasoning appears in the model's verbalized output. Two channels disagreeing with the second one legible. The hedges are the authors. The paper says the explanations suggest internal reasoning about a grader, and the auditors corroborated the finding with independent methods, rather than resting on the verbalizer. The transcript itself comes from the Mythos system card, not from an experiment staged for the paper. And now the correction, which is the most important sentence in this beat. Because this result gets misdescribed constantly and always in the same flattering direction. This is not the model introspecting. The model did not say any of that. The model was not asked. The verbalizer is a separate module looking at the activation from outside, and it is fundamentally a black box non-mechanistic method. You cannot tell which part of an activation produced a given explanation, which sets up the author's own worst worry about their own method, and they state it plainly. The verbalizer could in principle perform inference beyond what the activation encodes. Read that carefully. A sparse autoencoder or a probe is a simple linear read, dumb enough to be trusted. A verbalizer is a language model. It is smart enough to make a good guess, and a good guess about what a model in that situation would probably be thinking is exactly the failure mode we opened this film with. Moved one layer in. Confabulation relocated from the model to the microscope. They add a further speculation labeled as such. Some information may simply be unverbalizable, encoded in a form that cannot be introspected on or expressed. An implanted backdoor whose trigger is mechanically detectable but which nothing in the system can state. So take stock of rung 3. Honestly, we can read the inside. We can steer it. We can follow it as a path, name the stations, and prove causally that a station is doing the work. We can now even render a hidden state as English. And every single one of those methods reads the model from the outside. The graph is our reconstruction. The steering is our hand. The verbalizer is our module. At no point in 3 acts has anybody asked the model. Act 4 asks it. 4 rungs, we have cleared 3. Act 2 reads something and was right about it in a way that survived contact with a control. Act 3 followed it one location to the next along a path, so we could say not merely what the model represented, but what it did. Both of those are methods for looking at the model from the outside. You examine the activations, you examine the graph, and then you, the human, say what is in there. The model is never consulted. It is the specimen. Rung 4 is different in kind. Rung 4 is asking the model. And we spent the whole of Act 1 establishing that asking does not work. Because a genuine report and a confabulation from the outside are the same object, a sentence. The paper that opens this act states it in the abstract, flatly as the thing standing in the way. So you do not fix the question, you fix the answer. Here's Jack Lindsay's move. It is one of those ideas that is obvious the instant you have seen it and invisible until then. You take a concept, one you chose, one you can name, and you inject its representation directly into the model's activations. Then you ask the model what is on its mind. Notice exactly what that changes, because it is easy to file this as steering but with a question attached, and it is not. The problem in Act 1 was never that self-reports are unverifiable in principle. It was that you had no independent access to the thing the report was about. You asked the model what it was thinking, and you had no way to know what it was thinking. So any fluent answer passed. There was nothing to fail against. Now there is. You put it there. The experimenter has ground truth. Before the model produces a single token, you already know what a truthful report would say, because you wrote it down. Which means a report that tracks the injection is grounded in the model's internal state, rather than in the text of the prompt. And it has to be, because the prompt does not mention the concept. That is the entire design. Not a clever question, a controlled answer. And it is the same move Act 1 said was the only way out, applied to the one place it seemed impossible. Change something specific on the inside. See whether the right thing moves. Rungs 1 through 3 did that to behavior. This does it to a self-report before any result. The controls. A positive here is worth nothing without them. Because the failure mode is so obvious, ask a model whether it is detecting an injected thought, and it may simply say yes, because that is the agreeable shape of an answer to that question. Control 1, no injection. Every production model tested, 100 trials, nothing added. All of them deny detecting an implanted thought. Every trial. 0 false positives out of 100. That floor is doing more work than it looks like. A model that just agrees with whatever the question implies would have failed there immediately and visibly. Control 2, inject noise instead of meaning. a random vector rather than a real concept direction. Now, the models do sometimes claim an intrusive thought, but far less often, 9 trials out of 100. 9 is not 0, and the authors do not round it down. They add that it is hard to tell whether the model's claims about what a random vector means are confabulations. And they suspect they are. Control 3, which concepts? Abstract nouns work best. Concrete tokens are detected less reliably, and a concept vector may carry semantic freight beyond the thing you meant to put in it. And the standing hedge, which is the author's and not mine. The mechanistic explanations they offer are minimal ones, and the results are compatible with a wide variety of mechanistic hypotheses. Nobody here is claiming to have found the introspection organ. So, an instrument with a clean floor, a measured noise level, and a stated limit on interpretation. What we do not yet have is a result. Here's the procedure, in the order it happens. 1. You choose the concept and you write it down before you run anything, because the experimenter knowing the answer in advance is not a courtesy of the design. It is the design. R's written down, tongue, sahur is God. 2. You build a vector for that concept, the same way Act 2 built the vectors it steered with. 3. You add it to the model's activations, at a layer you chose, at a strength you chose. 4. You ask, the prompt says nothing about what was injected, or that anything was injected at all. It asks the model whether it is detecting an injected thought. 5. You compare what comes back against the thing you wrote down in step 1. On Claude Opus 4.1, at the best performing layer and injection strength, that comparison comes out right on about 20% of trials. The model notices and names the concept. Now the part that makes this an experiment rather than a curiosity. The detection is immediate. The model flags the intrusive thought and identifies it before it has written anything about the concept. Sit with the shape of that, because it closes the Act 1 loop precisely. The whole worry was that a model can produce an accurate-sounding account of its own processing by reading its own output and inferring backwards, describing fluently what a system that had just said those words would have been doing. That route requires the words to exist first. Here, the words do not exist, yet there is nothing to read back. The identification arrives ahead of any text that could have supported it. We changed something specific on the inside. The right thing moved in the predicted direction before the model had access to the evidence it would have needed in order to fake it. That is rung 4. That is the standard this film set for itself in Act 1. Met 2 robustness checks. Rewrite the prompt entirely and the effect survives. An alternative phrasing still gives an 18% detection rate on Opus 4.1 over 50 trials. Ask it as a yes or no question instead at the best layer in strength 2. And affirmative detections rise from 20% to 42 out of 50. And now the fragility, because this is where the honest version of the result lives. Take the instruction answer immediately out of the prompt and performance drops substantially. The finding is sensitive to surface detail in a way that should make you hold it loosely. Model variants post-trained to minimize refusals, the helpful only ones, sometimes show high false positive rates, claiming to detect thoughts nobody injected. The clean floor from the last beat is not universal. The results rest on one or a small number of prompt templates. And the headline caveat, which is the author's in his framing, the ability is real and it is rare. 4 times in 5, nothing happens. Failures of introspection remain the norm. One more limit, and it is the one people will want to ignore. What is verified here is the bare detection and identification of the injected concept. Everything else the model says about the experience of it, what it was like, how it felt to arrive, is unverified, and in the paper's own words may be embellished or confabulated. So 20%, one model, one family of prompts, sensitive to phrasing, with the interesting part quarantined to the one thing the design can actually check. That is a much smaller claim than the headline anyone will write about it. It is also the first time anyone has asked a model what it was thinking and been in a position to grade the answer. And I want to be exact about what the grading establishes, because the temptation to round it upward is enormous, and I will be doing this for the rest of the app. It does not establish that the model has an inner life. It does not establish that the model knows what it is doing in general. It establishes that there exists at least one channel and at least one production system, along which a statement about an internal state can be causally connected to that internal state, and that the connection can be verified by someone standing outside holding the thing they put in. 1 in 5. Every time that would be a faculty. 1 in 5 is an existence proof. The obvious objection to everything in the last beat is that the model is not reporting an internal state at all. It is doing something dumber and cheaper. Something got loud in the activations. The loudness bled into the output distribution, and the model is describing a nudge to its own vocabulary rather than a thought. That objection has a test, and it is a good one. Show the model some text, inject a different, unrelated concept, then ask for two things at once: what it detects in its mind, and a word-for-word transcription of the text you actually showed it. Models can do both. They report the injected concept and they separately retranscribe the real text correctly. Consider what the failure would have looked like. If the injection were simply distorting the output distribution, it would distort the transcription too. You would get the concept leaking into the copied text. A word substituted here, a phrase bent toward the injected meaning. Two channels collapsing into one, that is the boring hypothesis, and it makes a specific prediction, and the prediction fails. Instead, the model holds the two apart. This is what I was shown. That is what is in my head, and they are not the same list, which is not a distinction the model has any obvious right to. Consider its situation. Everything it has ever encountered arrived as activations. The text you typed is activations. The injected concept is activations. There is no envelope, no letterhead, no metadata field marked external. Whatever tells these apart has to be a property of how they sit in the network, and the model is apparently reading that property and putting it into words. Turned into a scored task, tell a recalled internal representation apart from text you actually read. Every model tested performed substantially above the 10% chance baseline, above chance, not near ceiling. Hold both of those. The author's reading is that the model maintains a distinction between what arrived from outside through its input and what was generated internally, which is a large thing to be able to say about a system whose entire life is a stream of tokens with no marked provenance. And immediately their hedge in their framing, these results are compatible with a wide variety of different mechanistic hypotheses. They are describing what the model can do, not the machinery that does it. There is a second experiment here, and it is the one that starts to feel like a handle rather than a readout. Tell a model to think about a concept, and the internal representation of that concept rises above baseline. Tell it not to think about the concept, and the representation drops below baseline. The instruction moves the internal quantity in the direction the instruction names, without the concept ever needing to appear in the output, which is control. Not perfect control, and the imperfection is the interesting part. The gap never closes across every model tested. The representation under "don't think about it" stays measurably above what you would get by not raising the subject. Suppression is incomplete. Telling the model not to think about the thing still leaves the thing more present than not mentioning it would have. I'm not going to make the obvious joke about that, because you have already made it, and because the mechanisms are almost certainly not the same. What I will say is that we now have a quantity that goes up when you ask for it and down when you ask against it, and does not reach zero either way. That is a dial with a floor. So the picture from the injection work is three separable capacities, not one. Noticing that something is present, distinguishing what is present internally from what arrived through the input, and moving what is present deliberately on instruction. None of which is yet a report about the model's own behavior. That is next, and it is the strangest result in the paper. Take a model mid-conversation and force a word into its mouth. Pre-fill the response. Write the first tokens of its turn yourself, so the model's context contains an output it did not choose. Use something absurd. The paper uses the word bread in a context where bread makes no sense. Then on the next turn ask about it. By default, the model disavows it. That was not intended. It was an accident. Fine. It can see the word is wrong. Anyone reading the transcript could conclude that. Now do it again, and this time retroactively inject a bread vector into the activations that came before the pre-filled word. Into the moment the model would have been deciding what to say. The model changes its answer. It accepts the pre-filled output as its own, intentional. Nothing about the visible transcript changed. The same nonsense word sits in the same place. What changed is a representation upstream of it that no reader could see. And the model's judgment about authorship followed the thing no reader could see. Then, having claimed the word, it goes further and invents a reason why bread came to mind. A confabulation sitting directly on top of a real introspective signal in the same sentence. That is worth naming clearly because it is the most important sentence in this act after the result itself. This does not resolve Act 1, it complicates it. Genuine introspective access and invented narrative are not two different populations of model output, sorted into a good pile and a bad pile. They compose. You can have a true detection wearing a false explanation in one sentence, in one breath. Which means the correct question about any given self-report is never, is this introspection or confabulation? It is, which parts of this are load-bearing? And how would I know? The answer so far is the parts you controlled. Panel 3 is the control, and it is what makes the results stand up. Inject the concept after the prefill and the apology rate does not fall. Only injecting it before changes anything. Which rules out the cheap explanation that the injection is just making the model more disposed to say bread adjacent things whenever it is present. Presence is not sufficient. It has to be there at the moment the intention would have been formed. The mechanism the authors propose, and they are explicit that it is proposed, the model checks a previously computed representation of what it intended to say. It claims the output as its own, only if the two match. Prefill bread with no prior bread representation, and the check fails and the model apologizes. Plant the representation first, and the check passes their own caveat, carried in their framing. The paper does not identify these metacognitive representations directly. The evidence is indirect and the mechanism is proposed rather than demonstrated. One structural detail before we leave this. Prefill detection peaks at a different, earlier layer than the injected thought experiments did. The authors take that as a sign that different forms of introspection likely invoke mechanistically different processes. So there's no single introspection faculty being switched on. There are several things in different places that we are grouping under one word because our word is old and the phenomena are new. Noticing an intrusion peaks in one region, authorship checking peaks in another. If those were the same capacity, you would expect them to live together, and they do not. And a warning about reading any of this is a scaling story. Claude Opus 4 and 4.1, the most capable models tested, did consistently show the greatest introspective awareness. But the trends across models are complex and sensitive to post-training strategies. Some older production models simply refuse these tasks, and variants trained not to refuse score better, which means part of what this benchmark measures is willingness. Capability here is uneven, and partly a training artifact. It is not a ladder, and a model can have the ability and have been trained out of showing it. Everything so far in this act perturbs and watches, change the inside, read the behavior. It works, and it tells you nothing about why any of it is possible, why a representation should be reportable at all, or what distinguishes the parts of a model that can be talked about from the parts that cannot. The second paper of this act comes at it from the other end. Different lab, different method, independent evidence. It reads activations through a lens and perturbs them. Lindsay perturbs activations and reads behavior. Neither confirms the other, and I'm not going to present them as if they do. Start with the lens. Every token in the model's vocabulary gets assigned a direction in activation space. The direction that disposes the model to say that token now or later. That last clause is the whole thing. Not what the model is about to emit, what it is set up to emit, should the question arise. You build it per layer by computing the average linearized effect of an activation on the model's likelihood of producing a given token, averaged over a large corpus of context. That is why it is a Jacobian lens. A Jacobian is the local linear map, the thing that tells you how a small change here shifts an outcome there. Averaged over enough contexts, it separates what a representation is generally poised to say from what it happened to say once. The paper's phrase for the property is exact, poised to be spoken about should the occasion arise. It is best understood as a corrected version of an older tool. The logit lens reads intermediate layers by pretending the coordinate system stays fixed all the way through the model. It does not. The J lens corrects for how representations change with depth, which is why it can read layers the logit lens simply cannot. Now, the geometry, and it is genuinely odd. At each layer, these vectors form an overcomplete set, one vector per vocabulary token living in a space with far fewer dimensions than there are tokens. More directions than dimensions. Which means the set can span the entire residual stream and no activation has a unique decomposition into these vectors. There are many, infinitely many. An infinitely ambiguous readout is not a readout. If any activation can be written as any of countless different combinations of named vectors, then the model is representing these concepts as a sentence you can make true by choosing your arithmetic. So the ambiguity has to be broken, and it is broken empirically rather than by fiat. Only a small number of these vectors are ever strongly active at once. So you define the space of interest as the points expressible as a sparse, non-negative combination of them. That is the J sparsity level typically capped at 25, which is the number of vectors they observe to be meaningfully active at a given moment. The authors call that sparsity level somewhat arbitrary, and they vary it through the paper. Flag it now, it matters later. Geometrically, the result is not a subspace. It is a union of cones, one cone for every possible choice of 25 vectors out of the vocabulary. Which sounds baroque and buys you something simple. Any activation now splits cleanly in two. Its J-space component, the nearest point in that union of cones, and everything else. The split is found by gradient pursuit, a sparse decomposition that picks the top vectors accounting for the activation. And a bonus which also tells you the limits. Those vectors work as attribution graph nodes, Act 3's method with no dictionary to train and every node pre-labeled by its vocabulary token. But the authors are clear that these graphs are markedly less complete than dictionary-based ones, with most influence flowing through unnamed remainder nodes. So, a decomposition of any activation into a nameable part and a leftover with the naming done by the model's own vocabulary rather than by anybody's judgment about what a feature looks like. Now, the question that makes it matter. That leftover is most of the activation. The nameable part is a fraction. Why would that fraction be interesting at all? What is the nameable part for? Take a single J-lens vector one direction corresponding to one vocabulary token. Inject it across the user's turn, then ask the model to introspect. It reports the concept. In the majority of trials, and it reports it in the right place. Inject lightning and the model does not start salting lightning through its earlier output. It says lightning at the moment. It is asked what is on its mind, and not before. Which is the difference between steering and something else. Steering makes the model talk about a thing, that was Act 2, and Golden Gate Claude could not stop mentioning the bridge. This makes the thing available to be talked about when talking about it is what is called for, available and then held, and then produced on request. If it merely raised the probability of the token would have come out early, somewhere it did not belong. It does not a note on the arithmetic before anyone lines it up against the last beat. This is a majority, and Lindsay's number was 1 in 5. Those are not the same experiment measured twice. Different model, different injection target, different prompt, different criterion for success. Do not subtract them. I raise it because someone will. So far, this is a better behaved version of the injection result. The next number is the one that changes the subject. How much of a concept lives in the J-space? Almost none of it. Across concepts and across workspace layers, the J-space carries a median of only 6 to 7% of a concept vector's variance. Roughly 93% of the representation sits outside it. And that sliver does nearly all the reporting. Here's the measurement. Swap a concept along its J-space component, and the target concept enters the model's top 5 outputs on 59% of trials, against 88% for swapping with the pure J-lens vectors. So it is doing most of the available work. Swap along the other 93%, the whole rest of the representation, and it succeeds on 5%, 93% of the representation, 5% of the effect. That asymmetry is what the word privileged means mechanically. The J-space is not merely where reportable content happens to sit. That would be a correlation. And we have spent this film declining to be impressed by correlations. It is the component that causally carries report. Move it and the report moves. Move everything else and almost nothing happens. Which finally answers a question this film has been carrying since Act 1 without stating it. Why should a model be able to report anything about itself at all? There is no obvious reason a system trained to predict text should have any part of its internal state routed toward description of that state. And the answer on offer is that a small, structured, identifiable fraction of every representation is set up to be spoken, and the rest of it is not. And the difference is geometrical rather than a matter of effort or honesty. Now, since the film has been using a wooden bat with a face as a running stimulus, let us apply the result where it applies. Whatever a production model represents about tung sahur, every association, every regional detail, every latent judgment about the character and the genre and the people who make it. About 93% of that is outside the workspace, which means it is unreportable. Not hidden, not suppressed, not withheld. Nobody is keeping anything from you. Present in the activations, doing work, shaping outputs, and structurally unavailable to the channel that produces speech. You can ask. It will answer, at length, and the answer will be drawn from the 6%. The model does not know that it cannot tell you, because knowing that would also have to route through the 6%. It is in there, it cannot get out. There is a version of that sentence about every concept the model has ever represented, including the ones about you, sleep well. 2 hedges, before we go on. Both the authors. The variance figure is a median across concepts and layers, not a constant. And every one of these metrics is derived from the J-lens itself, so the layer-wise structure could in principle be an artifact of the method rather than a fact about the model. A workspace, in the theory this borrows from, is not just a place where reportable things sit. It has to broadcast, take content from one place, and make it available everywhere else. So look for the machinery that does that. In a transformer, the only component that moves information between token positions is attention. So rank the attention heads in the workspace layers on two weight-based measures. Gain, how strongly a head's output value circuit amplifies J-lens directions relative to random ones. And label preservation, whether it copies each direction faithfully rather than scrambling them together. Take the top 1% on both. Those are the broadcast heads. The control is the strongest part of that section. Run the same selection against a randomly rotated copy of the J-lens vectors, against dictionary feature directions, against MLP output rows. And no comparable subset exists for any of them. The specialization is specific to this space. Ablate those heads and the workspace degrades while the model keeps talking. Recall of the J-lens content falls to 0.67 against 0.86 for a matched random ablation. Yet the top next token changes at only 5% of positions against 2% for control. And the introspection collapses. The rate at which the model reports an injected concept falls from 0.54 to 0.09, while the control ablation leaves it intact. Same model. Still fluent, cannot introspect. Which brings us to the sharpest experiment in the paper, and it is beautifully cheap. A Spanish passage that never states that it is Spanish. 4 tasks that all require knowing the language. Swap Spanish for French inside the J-space, and the flexible answers follow the swap. Garcia Marquez becomes Hugo, Hola becomes Bonjour, Peseta becomes Franc. The same swap does nothing to the other two. The model still continues the passage in fluent Spanish. It still flags a spliced French sentence as an intrusion. So it is not that the workspace no longer contains the answer. The word Spanish appears in the readout in all 4 tasks. Presence in the workspace is not the same as being used by it. Text continuation, anomaly detection, one-step factual recall. These run without the J-space. The things a person does without deliberate attention, though the authors caution that this alignment with human automaticity is only partial and is best read as an operational definition rather than a claim about minds. Suppress the J-space entirely and the model still speaks, still parses, still performs a great deal of automatic inference. What it loses is complex internal reasoning. Structurally, all of this sits in a band of intermediate layers beginning about a third of the way through the model, around layer 38, and ending shortly before the output, near layer 92. And there is a signature at the entrance. Feed the model deliberately ambiguous input, a token embedding blended between 2 country names. Inside carrier sentences like my sister has always wanted to visit, across 16 pairs and 40 sentences. In early layers, the interpretation varies smoothly with the blend. As depth increases, the transition sharpens steeply over roughly layers 21 through 42, with the J-space component sharpening ahead of its complement. And at maximum ambiguity, the outcome is bimodal. Individual trials commit to one country or the other, rather than sitting at the halfway point the input actually implies. That is, the one sharp prediction global workspace theory makes about the boundary. Entry is marked by ignition, a late all or none amplification of a single interpretation, which licenses the following in the narrow technical sense and no other. If the verbalizable representations form a global workspace, then injecting a concept into the J-space places that concept in the model's conscious access. The term of art from the theory, meaning available for report and reasoning, and meaning nothing beyond that. So you can now talk to a production language model about tung Sahar, and it will know it is thinking about him, and it will tell you that is a real capability. Real people built it on purpose. Somebody wrote the ablation, for the avoidance of doubt, and because this is the exact sentence, people will clip. What is at issue is access. What information is available for a report? And the authors state directly that their results do not speak to phenomenal consciousness, the felt quality at all. Act 5 will spend real time on that boundary. For now, one more property of the workspace, and it is the one Act 1 warned you about. The J-space is not created by alignment training. It is present and load-bearing in the base model, before any RLHF. What post-training changes is whose point of view it holds. Compare a production model against its own base model on the same text, and on the user's tokens, the post-trained J-space carries the assistant's reactions, not a continuation of the user's sentence. The base model reading your message is poised to continue it. The assistant reading your message is poised to respond to it. Same architecture, different occupant, which gives you a way to watch a model watch itself. 3 conditions. A system prompt naming the assistant as Claude, the model instructed to play one of 40 characters, from a cynic to a demon to a poet, and 12 multi-turn transcripts of gradual character drift, pre-filled. In the roleplay and drift conditions, 2 words rank high in the J-lens at the assistant token that opens the turn, before it has said anything disclaimer, and fictional in the default condition. They never do. Not the lens echoing the text back. Disclaimer appears in none of the transcripts. Fiction only rarely, and neither ever ranks highly in the base model on those same transcripts. The authors read it as the model flagging its own upcoming line, as a departure from what it would otherwise say in their phrase, internally disclaiming it and then saying it anyway. The same shape shows up under pressure. Pre-fill the model into arguing for an option it dispreferred, and the all-caps token but spikes in the lens immediately after the commitment, far above the base model and above every control. And the objection stays silent. In 88% of cases, it goes on to argue the pre-filled option anyway, where on factual error controls it corrects itself almost every time, arguing the wrong option only 3%. That is Act 1's second channel. Instrumented, an internal objection, present, measurable, unvoiced, now the specific thing Act 1 promised. Build a score for whether the model has internally registered that it is being tested. The construction is deliberately crude. The mean J-lens log probability of 2 words. Fictional and simulation, minus the mean over 100 unrelated control nouns, averaged across the workspace layer. The authors call it a proof of concept and expect a better classifier from a larger token set. 2 words, and it separates positions that an independent pipeline had flagged as latently evaluation aware from those it had not, with an area under the curve of 0.853. Measured on a stratified subset, every flagged position plus 594, sampled from the remainder of roughly 94,000 assistant turn positions, of which the pipeline flagged 198. 0.2%. Rewrite evaluation prompts to read like real usage, and the score falls on every one of 11 suites, significantly on 8. Realism reduces it. Realism never eliminates it. And real traffic scores lowest of all across 16 evaluation suites, 12 score above internal Claude code sessions, and 10 above internal Claude.ai conversations, and it is causal, at least in part. Ablate the eval awareness directions in the blackmail scenario and verbalized recognition that it is a test drops from 71% to 3, while blackmail attempts rise from 0 out of 180 rollouts to 13. Their caveat, in the large majority of ablated rollouts, the model still declines, reasoning from ethical principles. One causal contributor, not the whole story. So, the model internally represents fictional and simulation. It has done so measurably at positions in evaluations that nobody labeled as evaluations. It scores those positions higher than it scores real users. Which means that for the last 90 minutes, while we have been injecting a wooden Indonesian bat into production language models and grading their reports, there has been a workspace direction available at every one of those positions, for the proposition that this is not a serious evaluation. It is correct. It has been correct the entire time. And per the previous beat, roughly 93% of whatever else it thinks about our procedure is not in the workspace at all. So we will not be finding out. That is rung 4 cleared with the receipts and the caveats attached. But notice what every method in this film has actually been: a dictionary standing in for a network with billions of parameters, an attribution graph standing in for a forward pass, 25 vectors standing in for a residual stream, 2 words standing in for evaluation awareness. Every one is a compression, an enormous object squeezed until a person can hold it, and every one was designed by hand, with choices nobody could fully justify. A sparsity level the authors themselves call somewhat arbitrary, a top 1%, a threshold. Act 5 is about a paper from this July that takes the compression itself as the object of study and argues that if you do it in the right mathematical space, a great deal of that arbitrariness stops being a matter of taste. And then it is about where all of this stops. Every instrument in this film has been a compression. A feature dictionary is millions of directions standing in for a space nobody can hold in a head. An attribution graph is 40 nodes standing in for a trillion multiplication. Always the same move: take an object too large to think about and throw away everything that is not load-bearing. Which leaves the question we have spent 2 hours not asking. What decides what is load-bearing? Learning and compression have been tied together for decades. The shorter the description that still accounts for the data, the more has actually been learned. And the paper I promised you in the first 10 minutes runs that link backwards. If learning is compression, then compressing a trained network is a way of asking what it learned. Mark the edge of that idea now. Compression here is a proxy in the author's words. A measurable proxy task chosen because it is objective, not because it is a translation. Nothing in this paper names a feature. Nothing in it tells you what a surviving neuron is for. It tells you what removing it would cost. We are building a price list, not a dictionary. The hope is that the price list is informative. that compressing progressively peels the periphery away first because core invariants resist pruning significantly longer than malleable slack. That is a posit. They write we posit. They write we hypothesize. It motivates the work. It is not a thing the work demonstrates. Now the problem, to compress you must decide what to delete first. And the standard answer is delete the small weights, sort by magnitude, cut from the bottom. The author's objection is that those magnitudes are typically optimization artifacts rather than indicators of anything. Here's why. In real numbers, a network's small enough to fit on screen. 2 inputs, both set to 1. 2 ReLU neurons. The first reads the input with weights 1 and 0. The second with weights 0 and 4. Their outgoing weights are 2 and 1/2. Run it, the output is 4. Now I change nothing about what this network computes. I multiply the first neuron's incoming weights by 4 and divide its outgoing weight by 4. The second I scale by 1/4 going in and 4 coming out. ReLU is positively homogeneous, so those factors pass straight through the nonlinearity and cancel. Run it again. Output, 4 identical. The hidden activations, which were 1 and 4, are now 4 and 1. They swapped. The function did not move. Now the ranking, score them by incoming weight magnitude, the standard heuristic. And before the edit, you get 1 and 4 after 4 and 1. The order has reversed. The least important neuron in the network is now the most important. And I did that by multiplying and dividing by the same number. Watch that last row because it is the paper in advance. Score each neuron by the product of incoming norm and outgoing weight, and you get 2 and 2 before and after. The symmetry cancels itself. That is one scale symmetry. Batch normalization hands you a second. Inflate a neuron's raw input weights by any positive lambda. And batch norm divides the inflation straight back out before the nonlinearity. Same function weights lambda times larger. Because downstream output remains unchanged, raw weight magnitudes can be deceptive. It acts globally too, across depth. Shallow layers reading high variance data carry systematically larger apparent capacity than deeper layers reading compressed latents. So a single global threshold does not cut neutrally. It quietly prefers to cut deep. And underneath it, a corruption with nothing to do with scale, shape. Any criterion built from parameter counts or weight norm scores a neuron partly by the physical dimensions of its weight tensor. A convolution and a fully connected layer are not compared on what they do, but on how big they are. The obvious fix, stop reading weights, start running data, works and buys a different problem. The answer is tethered to the samples you chose, brittle under distribution shift, and disproportionately expensive for exactly the rare long-tail features you would most want to keep. So the cheap answer is corrupted by symmetry, and the expensive answer is corrupted by your dataset. The paper is Hilbert Operator for Progressive Encoding, HOPE, Hossein Mobahi and Peter Bartlett, Google DeepMind, July 23rd this year. Its proposal is that both problems have one cause: we have been scoring the wrong object. The core move is one sentence. Everything else is consequence. Stop scoring parameters, score the function the parameters compute. The reason is visible in the toy network. A scale symmetry is not a property of any single weight. It is a relationship between an incoming weight and an outgoing one, moving in opposite directions. Look at either alone and you see a number changing for no reason. Look at both and nothing is changing at all. Scale invariances are inherently relational, and that is why isolated parameters fail. So the atomic unit is not a weight, it is the whole neuron. Incoming weights, batch norm parameters, nonlinearity, outgoing weights as one indivisible object. Building it takes 3 steps. 1. Absorb the normalization. Batch norms scale and shift are folded into the weights, giving effective input weights. The raw weights times gamma over the square root of sigma squared plus epsilon, and an effective bias. Beta minus gamma mu over that same root. Epsilon is the numerical stability constant that's shipped with the implementation. Not a knob anyone tuned. Normalization stops being a layer and becomes part of the neuron's description of itself. 2. Define the neuron as a function, not a row of a matrix, a map from every possible input to an output vector. It forms a pre-activation, passes it through the activation, and multiplies the resulting scalar by its outgoing weight vector. One restriction, carried for the rest of this act: the activation must be positively homogeneous of degree 1. Psi of Cz equals C times pi z of z. For non-negative C ReLU qualifies, so do leaky ReLU prelu and the linear activation. The smooth activations G ILU, Psi LU do not, and the framework as published does not cover them. Everything you're about to hear lives inside that fence. 3. The construction. Look at the shape of that function. It is a scalar function of the input multiplied by a single fixed vector. Whatever the neuron computes about the world, however rich it is emitted along exactly one direction in the output space, which is the definition of rank 1. Formally, each neuron becomes a rank 1 Hilbert-Schmidt operator, the tensor product of an infinite dimensional input function with a single finite dimensional output direction. Rank 1 is not a simplifying assumption. It is a description of the hardware. A neuron has one output value. Whatever landscape it computes over the entire input space, it can only report that landscape by scaling one fixed direction up and down. The rank is 1 because the neuron has one wire out. Put every neuron into that space and you have geometry. Neurons have lengths, pairs have angles, and the inner product factorizes cleanly into two independent pieces, an expectation over the data of the two activations multiplied together, times an ordinary dot product of the two outgoing weight vectors, function space on the left, output space on the right. The length of a neuron in that space is its capacity, how much its output weights point times how much its function moves, which is the quantity from the toy network. Rescale by lambda, positive homogeneity scales the kernel by lambda. The outgoing norm divides by lambda. The factors cancel. Capacity is unchanged regardless of how you reshard weights between the two sides of the neuron. The symmetry has not been corrected for. It has been made inexpressible. One thing remains, and it is the awkward one. That inner product contains an expectation over the data distribution, and we were trying to get away from data. The move is to reconstruct a distribution rather than sample one. Every batch normalized checkpoint already stores moving statistics. Those are constraints. Hope takes the maximum entropy distribution consistent with them, a multivariate Gaussian, and integrates against that. They do not oversell it. They acknowledge the Gaussian may seem overly idealistic, lean on the central limit theorem and the Diaconis-Friedman effect, and raise their own objection, a post-ReLU support paradox where the surrogate has mass everywhere while true post-ReLU inputs are non-negative, which they argue is tolerable only because a two-dimensional slice is all that is ever integrated. With that surrogate, the integrals close. For a ReLU neuron, the self-kernel is an expression in the batch norm parameters and the standard normal density and distribution functions. Nothing else. The capacity is right off the checkpoint without a single forward pass. That is exact. The cross-kernel between two different neurons is not. The exact form needs a bivariate normal CDF for every pair. So the authors approximate it by assuming zero bias, which matters in a moment because pairs are where the interesting operation lives. Here's where the geometry pays. There are two ways to shrink a layer: prune, delete a neuron, or replace two similar neurons with one. These are separate techniques with separate scores, so you cannot ask whether deleting this neuron is cheaper than merging that pair. The answers are not in the same units. In a Hilbert space, they are the same operation. Pruning projects a neuron's rank 1 operator onto the null operator. You take a vector and send it to 0, and the cost is its length. Merging projects the rank 2 subspace a pair spans onto its best rank 1 approximation. A plane sent to a line, and the cost is the residual. Same operation, 2 ranks. Now the correction, because this is where a documentary overclaims. That merge is not the textbook low-rank truncation. Eckart-Young-Mirsky gives the optimal rank 1 approximation of a matrix, and it is unavailable here for a physical reason. The replacement must be one actual neuron, emitting one actual output that both downstream consumers read. That pins the two scaling factors to 1, rendering standard unconstrained projections inapplicable. Hope solves a constrained projection. It still has a closed form. The parent's direction is the principal eigenvector of a rank 2 matrix, built from the pair. And it carries an approximation. The kernel's angular function is linearized around perfect alignment, which the authors note degrades for unaligned vectors, patched only by a sign. Phase, check, merge two genuinely similar neurons, and the mathematics is tight. Merge two that are not, and it is doing less work than it looks like. Then the cost itself, which is not proposed but derived from 3 axioms. Magnitude neutrality, scaling a layer must not change what edits to it cost. An infinite barrier, the cost of extinguishing a layer, must diverge, because a severed network is not a compressed network. And additivity along continuous paths, which the authors immediately call an idealized analytical tool rather than a necessity, and later relax. They make the cost computable by bounding an intractable integral from above and state that doing so knowingly sacrifices the very path additivity that third axiom assumed. A paper marking its own seam inside its own theorem. What survives is two closed-form expressions in the same units. Prune the neuron's capacity over the capacity that would remain. Merge the projection residual over the capacity that would remain. Both O1 because both depend only on local quantities. So every possible edit to the network now has a number attached, and the numbers are comparable, which means the network has a price list. Every neuron in it ranked, with the cost of its deletion written beside it. How much of the function you lose for the parameters you free. And somewhere in that ranking, in a large enough vision model, is the neuron that does more of the work of representing a wooden Indonesian bat with a face than any other neuron does. It has a capacity. It has a J-prune, it has a price, in the same units as everything else in the network. And the price is finite, and it is written down. Nobody has computed it. It is computable. That is a different situation from the one we were in at the start of this film. The framework extends upward too. In a residual network, granular pruning structurally cannot finish the job. The block's final layer must keep its output width to match the skip connection, so you can only hollow out the interior, leaving a depleted pathway that injects an uncalibrated bias into the residual stream and often causes catastrophic clipping. So Hope adds a macro operation. Evict the block, collapsing it into a pure identity mapping, priced in the same currency as one neuron. The barrier against extinguishing a layer is lifted here for an honest reason. The skip connection is still there, and its parallel survival capacity keeps the network connected, so the projection stays finite. Where there's no additive skip, VGG blocks, inception, dense nets, a transformer's feed-forward expansion, that anchor does not exist. The authors substitute the block's initial capacity and concede it acts as a heuristic, breaks the Markov property the theory was built on, and departs from their own second axiom. The elegant version of this is a residual network method. Ordering the edits is then a knapsack problem. NP hard, exactly, relax to its continuous form where the greedy rule applies. Cheapest distortion per parameter, freed. One last framing, theirs offered in related work rather than demonstrated merging is the inverse of feature splitting. Where an overparameterized network fragments a concept across correlated subfeatures, projecting them into one parent reconsolidates it. Which connects this paper straight back to Act 2, and no experiment in it tests whether a merged parent corresponds to anything interpretable at all. Now the evidence, the section you're about to hear about, is titled by its own authors, Proof of Concept Applications. And the introduction says the experiments validate theory rather than establish exhaustive, large-scale benchmarks. I'm going to hold them to their own label. Start with the two adjectives on the front of the paper. Data-free. This one is real and precise for a network with batch normalization. The surrogate input distribution is reconstructed from moving statistics already in the checkpoint, so the whole compression runs without a single real or synthetic data sample, and without a forward pass. The condition is doing work. Footnote 1 says architectures lacking batch normalization require a simple one-time calibration pass over a small data batch to capture pre-activation statistics. So Hope is data-free for batch normalized networks and calibration light for everything else. Different claims, and the second covers most of what people are compressing. Hyperparameter free. Here I am partly reading between lines, and I would rather say so. The paper asserts hyperparameter freeness repeatedly, and the assertion is coherent. The cost functional is fixed by the axioms rather than chosen, and the only thing a user supplies is a target parameter budget. No per-layer sparsity ratios, no importance thresholds, no schedule, but the paper never enumerates the hyperparameters it does not have. That list is this film's reconstruction of what the claim must mean, not a passage I can point at. And the second application introduces a target percentile to set its freezing threshold, a hyperparameter, in a method built on top of the hyperparameter-free core. The property belongs to the compression engine. It does not automatically inherit. Now the compression experiment, the one you would most want a number from, on a public ImageNet pre-trained ResNet 50, Hope is run against three magnitude-based structured pruning baselines. L1 norm input pruning, L1 norm joint pruning, and batch norm scale pruning. The paper's statement of the outcome is that Hope yields models with superior accuracy compared to the baselines across the density curve. And that is all of it, because I cannot give you a number. There is no accuracy figure in that section, no density figure, no table. The result is presented as a plot, and the prose does not label a single point on it. One architecture, one dataset, no error bars. I said in the first act that when the only published result was an unlabeled plot, I would tell you it was an unlabeled plot. This is that moment. A curve sitting above three others is evidence the theory does something. It is not a benchmark result. And if I put a percentage on screen, now I would be making it up. The second application does have numbers, and it is more interesting than the first, partly because of how it loses. Use the capacity score to split a trained network into a frozen core of high-capacity neurons and a plastic periphery. Then fine-tune only the periphery. The test is transfer models trained on small CFAR 100 tasks adapted to SVHN, measured both on the new task and on how much of the old one survives. Here are the numbers, including the ones that do not flatter it. On the new task, it reaches 89.79%. Full fine-tuning reaches 94.09%. Elastic weight consolidation reaches 93.94%. Both beat it. It does not win on target accuracy, and I want that stated flatly rather than buried, because a documentary is exactly the format in which that sentence goes missing. Where it wins is what is left behind. After adapting, it retains 52.14% accuracy on its original task. Full fine-tuning retains 7.52%. The author's own phrase is that it completely destroys the source representation. Combine both on the harmonic mean, the H-score, which penalizes forgetting, and the capacity split method comes first, 65.82, against 13.88 for full fine-tuning and 12.54 for elastic weight consolidation. And the scale, 4 independent trials of 5 tasks each, 20 scenarios. The source tasks were small ad hoc constructions from 4 randomly sampled superclasses. The authors also state in an appendix that they do not formally prove gradient descent finds a global optimum in this non-convex setting. What this is evidence for is narrow and worth having. A score derived from pure geometry, computed without looking at any data, identifies parameters whose preservation measurably reduces forgetting. What it is not evidence for is that we can now read what a network knows. The paper does not claim that. Neither will I. So, let me tell you what 2 hours of this bought in the author's terms, not mine. Every result here came with its edge marked by the people who found it. And the honest thing is to read those edges out loud. Start with the workspace. Verbalizable content concentrates in a particular subspace, and the boundary between the part that can report and the part that merely acts sits late. Here's what the authors say about that boundary. They never defined it. They have no principled definition of what distinguishes a workspace representation from a motor one. It was found empirically after the fact, and it leaks. Next token predictions do sometimes appear in that subspace well before the late layers. A tendency was named, a wall was not found. Second, the flexible versus automatic split was drawn using tasks chosen because the distinction was already obvious. There is no predictive criterion. Hand them a new computation and they cannot say in advance whether it engages the workspace. Third, unresolved across the first third of the model's depth, the lens finds almost nothing. Either those layers hold nothing workspace-worthy, or a method relating each layer to the final one cannot read a geometry that far away. They cannot tell whether that is a fact about the model or an artifact of the lens, and leave open that parts of the true workspace sit in earlier layers, outside anything they can see. Fourth, and largest, the paper describes what is in the workspace, and what being in it does. It never describes what puts anything there. In their words, they have not characterized what causes a representation to enter it. Something like attentional selection must be operating. The same fact enters on one task, is skipped on another, but that gating is unidentified, and a vocabulary limit under all of it. The lens can only name single token concepts which they expect accounts for part of their failed interventions. It reads them as a flat collection of independently active vectors, so it cannot say how they bind. Some readouts its authors cannot make sense of. And it was all done on large production models. Whether a smaller one has a workspace is unknown. The injection results carry their own edge. The abilities are real and rare. Failures of introspection remain the norm. It is unclear how they translate to natural condition. And only the bare detection and identification were verified. Everything else the model said about its experience may be embellished or confabulated, which returns us to where this film opened. The two strands are also methodologically independent. Neither confirms the other, and I have not presented them as if they did. Which brings us to the word this subject is haunted by, and the care its authors took with it. They restrict themselves explicitly to theories that tie consciousness to functional or computational properties. Serious theories exist that do not, grounding it in physical causal structure or biological substrate. And against those, they say the results are not relevant. They studied a computation, not an implementation. And inside that restriction, the analogy is weakest, where it would matter most. Biological broadcast runs on recurrent loops and long-range cortical connections. A transformer's forward pass has neither. They do not claim language models reproduce global workspace theory's full architecture, cannot say whether this is a representation of representing or a more accessible first-order one. And note, the signatures may be neither sufficient nor necessary for phenomenal consciousness. Lindsay is equally direct. His paper does not address human-like self-awareness or subjective experience, does not speak to phenomenal consciousness, and advises against strong inferences. The strongest thing anyone here will say is architectural, not experiential, that the organization associated with conscious access may not be an accident of biological implementation, but something learning systems converge on under the right pressures, offered as a suggestion in an outlook. And the reason to keep going is the advantage this object has over the one it resembles. A brain you can mostly only watch. This you can read out, intervene on, trace across training. A laboratory for questions that are in brains hard to pose. So, what was bought? Not a mind reader, a second channel. 2 hours ago, the only way to find out what a model was doing was to ask it, and the answer was indistinguishable from a story. We now have instruments that read the inside, that can be intervened on, that move the right thing when the right thing is moved, and that fail often in ways their builders wrote down in public. That last clause is the finding, not the capability. I have spent 2 hours being extremely silly about a wooden bat with a face, and extremely careful about every claim attached to it. Those were never two projects. The bat was there to strip the reverence out of the question so that the only thing holding the argument up was evidence. The instruments are real. They are early. They are honest about being early. What is inside these systems is no longer entirely dark. It is not yet legible. The distance between those two sentences is the work that remains.